Hey everybody, Colton here, and I think that He Who Remains, the Kang variant who won the multiversal war and created the sacred timeline, is also the one responsible for turning the villainous Dr. Victor Von Doom into our beloved hero, Tony Stark. Let me explain. So, there are hidden clues that lead me to believe that not only did He Who Remains wipe Reed, Sue, Johnny, and Ben from existence because they were a threat to his ruling of the multiverse, but that Victor Von Doom, Kang's biggest threat, wasn't erased and was kept around for a very important reason. Doom was the key to Kang winning the war and becoming the god of all time. So, I'm going to explain how He Who Remains rewrote and drastically altered Doctor Doom's life in the sacred timeline, making it to where the man who was supposed to grow up to become Doctor Doom was instead orphaned, adopted by Howard and Maria Stark, and then went on to become Iron Man. But with Loki's dethroning of He Who Remains, allowing for the multiverse to now expand beyond that of the sacred timeline, we now have a multiverse where Doctor Doom can return from his cosmic erasure. And he will be determined to take the reins of the multiverse from Loki and make sure that he can never be wiped from time again. And hey, by the way, my lovely wife made this great Doctor Doom and Iron Man pointing meme shirt. You can get yours at the link in the description below. So this entire story was all teased and set into motion years ago in Avengers Endgame and Loki Season 1 when Tony Stark inadvertently freed Loki from his predetermined path and Loki embarked on his journey to freeing the multiverse. Now, of course, we later do find out that it was actually He Who Remains who arranged for Loki to detour from his predetermined path, which means he was kind of still on a predetermined path. But it's also interesting that the same way that He Who Remains has used Loki as a pawn, he used Tony Stark, aka Doctor Doom, as yet another pawn for making all of this happen. Which will tie into my later point that Doctor Doom, or Tony Stark, and of course Loki, are the two most important characters of Kang's takeover of the multiverse, and will be the two most important characters in Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. So anyway, this freeing of the multiverse that we saw at the end of Loki Season 2 will ultimately be Loki's own downfall because we will see the reins of the multiverse taken from him the same way that he took them from He Who Remains. Let me explain. So, the Sacred Timeline was a collection of various timelines that run parallel to one another and never veer off their predetermined path, and they never collide with one another. Reason being that the TVA policed the sacred timeline and prevented it from ever expanding into a vast multiverse and also prevented these universes from colliding with one another, thus preventing incursions. Now, in this timeline that He Who Remains designed existed the mainline MCU, which was a story of events crafted by He Who Remains, and in his grand design, he assigned certain people certain roles. A key pillar of He Who Remains' sacred timeline was that Lokis were bad and served the purpose of being villains so that others could be heroes.
You were born to cause pain and suffering and death, all so that others can achieve their best versions of themselves.
Anytime a Loki tried to break from this predetermined path and find a glorious purpose rather than a villainous purpose, the TVA would interfere. But as we saw in the Loki series, Loki has now dethroned He Who Remains, and the sacred timeline is now just one of many timelines and universes allowed to expand and grow into this tree-like multiverse rather than that of an Ouroboros, which is like this circular timeline loop that only allows for certain things to happen, robs people of their choice, and it happens
again and again and again because it's supposed to, because it has to.
Now, this timeline, the sacred timeline, it still exists within the multiversal tree, as we learn in Deadpool and Wolverine, but like I said, it is now part of the grander multiverse.
The sacred timeline, I assume I'm going to marvel at how cinematic it feels.
Now, I give you this refresher because it is only now that He Who Remains is out of the picture that universes like the universe of the new Fantastic Four are allowed to once again exist. Under the rule of He Who Remains, these characters and their universes did not exist, and I think that will be the in-universe reason that the Fantastic Four weren't in the mainline MCU up until this point. Now, the real reason is, of course, that Marvel Studios didn't have the film rights, but within the story itself, the actual canon reason, I think we'll learn that He Who Remains viewed Reed Richards and the Fantastic Four as a great threat. So, in his crafting of reality, he erased Reed and the Fantastic Four from existence. And perhaps to replace them, he even created the Avengers. And let me be super clear, Loki taking the reins from He Who Remains at the end of Loki Season 2, despite that happening like later in the Multiverse Saga, it is actually the first canonical event of the Multiverse Saga. So that is why in films like Quantumania and Multiverse of Madness, we saw other universes, even a universe that had a Reed Richards and maybe even a Tony Stark Doctor Doom if these Ultron bots that totally look like Doom bots are any indication. There was also, of course, that empty chair on the Illuminati dais, and we know from the comics that Tony Stark is a member of the Illuminati. So anyway, with the Fantastic Four comes the very powerful reality manipulator Franklin Richards, the son of Reed and Sue, and who we will very likely be meeting in Fantastic Four First Steps, with Sue being pregnant. Franklin is a character who could certainly be a threat to Kang's rule. But it's not only the good guys that Kang feared. There's Doctor Doom as well, who would have had no doubt been a thorn in the side of Kang in his ascendance to becoming He Who Remains and ruling the multiverse. Doom would want that throne for himself. But unlike the Fantastic Four, He Who Remains couldn't simply erase Doom from time. Reason being that in order for his timey-wimey reconstruction of the timeline to work, in order for He Who Remains to build his precious sacred timeline, he needs, of course, time travel. And a multiversal constant, a nexus event, a canon event, an absolute point in time, an undeniable truth, whatever you want to call it, is that this guy created time travel. Now, we know this guy as Tony Stark because the Infinity Saga was the story of the sacred timeline that He Who Remains had crafted. But what if that wasn't always the case? What if this guy was originally Dr. Victor Von Doom and he was the guy who cracked the code on time travel?
Shit.
He Who Remains would have likely tried many equations that allowed for him to simply erase Victor from history, just like he did with Reed and the Fantastic Four. But every time he tried this, the multiverse would collapse. So He Who Remains tried another approach. The same way he destined Loki to be adopted by Odin and become a villain to bolster characters like Thor and the Avengers, he will do the same but opposite for Victor Von Doom. He will make this grand villain the hero of the story. In the sacred timeline, He Who Remains changed the flow of time to have young Victor's parents die. Remember, Doom's mother dying is a huge part of his character development in the comics. Anyway, He Who Remains has Doom's parents die, and Victor instead gets adopted by Howard and Maria Stark, and thus Tony Stark was born. There's even this great moment in Avengers Endgame to back this theory up, where it is hinted that Tony Stark was adopted.
My wife's expecting. And, too much time at the office. Congratulations.
See that look on his face? That's a math ain't mathin' look. So, in a lot of ways, this Tony guy is still Victor Von Doom. He still goes on to don a metal mask, he still has this high-tech, souped-up armor, and he does still create time travel, but he has now been essentially nerfed and neutered into a spoiled rich man-child under the thumb of He Who Remains, and he is now walking his predetermined path, playing his part, and being robbed of his free will. And honestly, I could see He Who Remains making the argument that he bettered Doom's life by creating a world without
The smartest man alive, Reed Richards.
He was an academic rival of Victor and always seemed to best him. In this sacred timeline with no Reed, Doom was able to become the smartest man alive and have all of the fame and glory that he was always envious of Reed for having. Fame and glory that we'll be getting a glimpse at in First Steps. While in the original multiverse, it was Reed who was viewed as the smartest man alive and one of the greatest superheroes, now in the sacred timeline, it's Victor, or Tony Stark, who is viewed as one of the most innovative geniuses and smartest man alive, and the superhero.
You have my respect, Stark.
And, you know, if you look from time to time in the sacred timeline, the Infinity Saga, if you will, that mainline MCU, we have seen bits and pieces of what could have been Victor Von Doom slipping through the cracks of Tony Stark when he is behaving like an isolationist, I have to protect the world and solve every problem, freedoms be damned type of character. Those cracks in Tony Stark could be his true self, Victor Von Doom, bleeding through. And that darker half of Tony that we have seen bleed through in films like Age of Ultron and Civil War, those represent that despite He Who Remains' efforts, he couldn't keep the beast buried forever. He just needed him around long enough to create time travel. And that is why very soon after Tony cracks time travel and we see this Mobius strip form, Tony dies.
What they did was supposed to happen.
He Who Remains always wanted Doom gone, but he needed him, so he made him his puppet, used him for what he needed, and then had him die almost immediately thereafter so that he could no longer be a potential threat. And this brings me into the Loki of it all. With Loki now having dethroned He Who Remains, the multiverse is able to expand beyond that of the sacred timeline, which means that characters like the Fantastic Four and Doctor Doom can now come into existence, and you can imagine how pissed Doom will be when he figures out what Kang did to him, turning him into this altered version of himself, killing his mother, and using him as a pawn. Doom is going to travel to the end of time to find and destroy He Who Remains. And hey, maybe we'll even see Doom roll in and kill the Council of Kangs that we met in Quantumania. But anyway, once he arrives at the throne of Loki at the end of time where once sat the Citadel, he will find not He Who Remains, but Loki. And having stemmed from Universe 616, Loki will also know this guy as Tony Stark, but he'll also have likely seen Doom coming and know all about what Kang did to Doom, making him Stark, etc. because, he sees everything. And we can even get a great line where Loki says that he's been waiting for Doom, mirroring that of He Who Remains having been waiting for Loki. I've been saying for years now, ever since Loki Season 1, that Loki is the new Tony Stark of the Multiverse Saga, and this was before they announced that RDJ would be returning as Doom. Loki's story in Season 1 and 2 of his series was about him bucking the villainous predetermined path that had been set for him, and instead going on his hero's journey and changing his story, similar to that of Tony Stark, who was on a bit of a villainous path himself with his weapons manufacturing and being a rich prick.
Hello, I like money.
But he was thrown off that path into a desert where he was trapped in a cave, saw himself for what he was, and decided to change, just like Loki was thrown into a desert, locked in a cage, saw himself for who he was, and decided to change. And who put Loki on that path? Coincidentally, Tony Stark in Avengers Endgame. But as we just discussed, that path was indeed designed by He Who Remains. Anyway, I say all of this because I personally just find it super poetic that not only are we seeing like the villain of Phase 1 and the hero of Phase 1 switching roles as main hero and main villain in Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars, but it could all be because He Who Remains took their free will from them and made them be puppets for his own goals. And this just makes for an even greater story to come in Doomsday when we get to see Loki and Doom share the screen again, just like this scene in that first Avengers movie.
There's no throne. There is no version of this where you come out on top. Maybe your army comes, and maybe it's too much for us, but it's all on you.
But now both are broken free from the chains that once bound them, and they are being the true selves they were meant to be before He Who Remains interfered, thus explaining why Tony always had villainous tendencies and Loki always had heroic tendencies. And now we are getting a rematch between these two titans, but now on opposite sides of the battle of good and evil. But let's face it, both Loki and Tony/Doom have always been similar in the fact that they feel they know what is best for everyone. So I am really looking forward to just the thematic beats of seeing these two characters clash once again, but now on opposite sides of that spectrum. But hey, that's just my theory. I would love to hear yours down in the comments below. And I just want to say, I really do hope that despite Kang being gone, I do hope that the actions we've seen him take in previous projects will still be a major factor in this unfolding story. Now, if you're new here, please do be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you get notified every time we upload a new video, especially one of our Avengers Doomsday Theory videos. I've been Colton Ogburn, and I'll see you next time. Bye!
You're still here. It's over. Go home.